She played for hours. Every single day, at exactly 4:16 in the afternoon, the sound would begin, soft at first, like marbles being stirred in a velvet pouch, then sharper, rhythmic, a click, a tap, a scrape, and always from the same room, the parlor. The house at the end of Fallow Ridge had stood empty for nearly 2 decades. Then, in the summer of 1857, Evelyn May Caro returned. She was 22, pale and slender, with dark hair that refused to hold a braid. Her mother had died in the house years before, under what the town kindly called unsettled conditions. Her body had been found curled in the parlor, surrounded by a circle of pennies, buttons, and bones no larger than a rabbit's. Evelyn never spoke of her. She arrived alone, with only a small trunk, a folded shawl, and a cloth-bound journal. She wore the same gray dress every day and walked with a slight limp. But what unnerved the townspeople wasn't her silence or her clothing or the way she stared too long at children. It was what she did at 4:16. She would sit cross-legged on the parlor floor, exactly where her mother had died, and begin to play. There was no board, no cards, no chalk or dice, just her hands gliding in slow, deliberate patterns. Then her lips would move, muttering things no one could quite make out. Names, maybe, or numbers. The neighbors tried not to look, but some did, and they would swear later, under breath or bourbon, that she was never alone in that room, that there was always something across from her, something playing back. Before we go further, if stories like this keep you watching late into the night, if you find yourself drawn to the forgotten, the unexplained, and the deeply unsettling, then you're in the right place. Like the video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss what lies beneath the surface. These aren't just tales, they're echoes. Now back to Evelyn. The house itself had always had a bad reputation. Before the Caros owned it, it had been a boarding school for girls. Before that, a meeting hall for a fire and brimstone church called the Risen Belt. The foundation stones still bore faint carvings, barely visible unless the light struck them sideways, loops and interlocking squares that didn't match any local script. But it wasn't until Evelyn returned that people began whispering again. Old Mrs. Tully, who lived 2 doors down, claimed to see Evelyn pacing the yard at night, barefoot and whispering into a pocket watch. Reverend Knox said she once caught Evelyn in the chapel after hours, seated in the pews, eyes rolled back, humming what he called a child's song with no rhythm. Then came the sounds. Every evening, after the church bells rang for supper, the house would groan. Not with the normal settling of wood or wind, but something mechanical, precise. 1 beat, 2 silences, then a dragging sound, like fingernails on slate. Sometimes a sudden thud. No one dared knock. No one wanted to know. Then the first visitor came. Her name was Daisy Harland, 17 years old, known for her curiosity and her temper. On July 12th, she left her home saying she was going to find out what game that woman plays. She never returned. Her mother went to the sheriff, who knocked at the Caro house the next morning. Evelyn answered the door with a strange calm. "I don't get visitors," she said. "I wouldn't know what to offer." "Did Miss Harland come by?" the sheriff asked. Evelyn blinked, then turned to look over her shoulder. "That was yesterday's piece," she murmured. The sheriff, unnerved, left. That night, Daisy's shawl was found folded neatly on the front step of her home. From then on, no one approached the house. But they watched, and Evelyn kept playing. One man, a Civil War veteran named Josiah Bell, claimed he watched her for 3 hours through a spyglass. What he saw, he said, made him give up drinking. She weren't alone, he told a reporter once, years later. She had her hands moving like she was dealing cards, but nothing was there. Then suddenly, she'd slap the ground like she'd won a hand, and every time she did, something in the room would shift, like a curtain twitching when the wind don't blow. The reporter asked if it could have been imagination. Bell only said this. She looked straight at me through the glass, like she knew. Word spread. Rumors, too. Some said she was conjuring something. Others said she was trying to win back her mother's soul. A few whispered the game was older than her bloodline, something passed down like a curse. The town's midwife swore she'd seen Evelyn with her hands covered in soil, lips muttering, digging circles behind the well. When asked what she was doing, Evelyn replied, placing the markers. If I don't, she cheats. She who? The girl I used to be. By September, Evelyn stopped leaving the house altogether. The mail piled up, groceries spoiled on the porch. But each day, at 4:16, without fail, the sounds returned. Tap, tap, thud, laugh, click. By October, no one dared walk past the house. That's when the second journal was found. It had been tucked behind the pulpit in the old chapel, bound in faded red leather. It wasn't Evelyn's handwriting, but her mother's. The last entry read, "She was born on the 7th echo. That's why the game favors her. I taught her the rules too early, and now it's too late to undo them. She doesn't play alone. She never did." By winter, Evelyn May Caro would vanish. And the game? It would begin again. Different house, different name, same rules. But this is how it started. And what really happened inside the parlor of that house on Fallow Ridge in 1857? Well, that's what we're going to uncover next. The first winter frost had already hardened the dirt paths when Reverend Knox received the letter. It had no stamp, no return address, and was folded into an envelope sealed with what looked like wax, but smelled faintly of iron. The handwriting was spidery and uncertain, like it had been scratched into the page rather than written. Only 4 words adorned the front. Do not forget her. Inside was a single page. No greeting, no farewell. Just a passage. She plays not to win, but to continue. Each turn is a tether. Each laugh a binding. You hear her now only because she lets you. When she stops, you won't. He burned it immediately. But he couldn't forget it. That evening, he walked the length of Fallow Ridge with his scarf pulled high and his collar tight. He passed the Caro house like a man walking beside a grave. The windows were dark. No candle, no firelight. Only shadows in the curtains. Still, he heard it, faint but unmistakable. A click, a pause, then something soft and high, like a girl humming through her teeth. He turned and walked home faster than he had in years. It wasn't long after that the dreams began, shared dreams as it turned out. Children across the county, those young enough not to lie and too innocent to dramatize, began waking with the same phrases on their lips. The lady with the hands. She smiled without teeth. I touched the wrong piece. Some wet their beds. Others refused to sleep at all. And always, when their parents pressed them, the children would repeat the same phrase. She played first, then it was my turn. But none of them could say what the game was. One child, Martha Gray, age 6, described it in a way no adult could quite explain. She made a circle. Inside it was all black, but you could feel things looking. And when you sat down, they stopped looking and started listening. By mid-November, 5 children had been taken to the local doctor for night terrors and unexplained scratches on their arms. One boy claimed he woke up with dirt under his nails. Another said a small stone had been placed in his mouth as he slept, too round and smooth to be natural. All of them had one thing in common. They'd walked past the Caro house that week. The sheriff finally returned. He brought 2 deputies this time. one to stay at the front door, one to circle round back. But the moment the front door was opened, unlocked, as always, they were hit with a smell none of them would ever forget, like mold and blood and wet iron. They found Evelyn in the parlor, alive, kneeling. Her hands were cupped in front of her, palms up, as if holding something. But her hands were empty. She did not look at them. She did not blink. She was humming, something old and tuneless, as if making it up as she went. Her lips moved with no sound. Her eyes were rolled slightly upward, but not in trance, in focus, as though staring at someone just above them, or something. The deputies approached cautiously. One reached out. The moment his fingers touched her shoulder, her mouth opened, and she whispered, "You've joined." He recoiled. The other deputy stepped forward. In his official report, he wrote, "She looked at me as though I were already gone. She said my daughter's name, said she'd be better at the game than I ever would." He did not have a daughter. They brought her in that night, locked her in the county holding cell. No charges, only observation. But she didn't resist. She walked with them calmly, carrying nothing but her journal. That night, the deputy on duty reported strange tapping from inside the cell, as if Evelyn were knocking on the bars, but in a rhythm too complex to be accidental. The next morning, the sheriff found the journal. Evelyn had disappeared. The journal was open to a single page, dated that day. The game does not end, only pauses, pieces shift, rules stay. I have passed the circle. You must now learn to listen. That was the last anyone saw of Evelyn May Caro, but the game, it didn't stop. Within weeks, other towns reported strange happenings. In Waterbridge, Arkansas, a seamstress was found sewing perfect miniature dresses, despite claiming she had no memory of doing so. In Belhaven, Kentucky, an orphanage burned to the ground. Only one child survived. She told rescuers the other children were hiding in the black circle, waiting for her to clap her hands. And in Laurel Creek, Tennessee, a man named Edgar Rowe claimed to see a girl outside his window every night for 13 nights straight. She never knocked, never spoke. Just watched, then left when the church bell rang midnight. On the 14th night, he vanished. In each case, the same pattern emerged. A young woman playing something unseen, a game with no rules, a circle drawn somewhere, and a whisper, always a whisper, about turns, pieces, penalties. By early spring, Reverend Knox had lost half his congregation. Some had moved away. Others locked their doors and would not come out, even for Sunday service. He returned to the chapel once more, this time not to pray, but to dig. Beneath the pulpit he found it, a circle carved into the stone, smooth, perfect, the size of a man's shoulders. Around it were names, some etched deeper than others. He recognized none of them except the last. E. May Caro. He began to weep. Then, as he turned to leave, he heard it. Just behind him, not footsteps, a scrape, a laugh, and a single sharp click. He never left the chapel again. And when the sheriff came looking, all he found was a single page, nailed to the door with a knitting needle. It read, "You watched her play, now it's your move." Spring came late to Fallow Ridge that year, as if the earth itself was reluctant to bloom. The frost lingered well into March, and the birds, those cheerful harbingers of new life, were conspicuously silent. And in the wake of Evelyn May Caro's disappearance, silence was no longer a comfort. The chapel remained closed, boarded hastily with pine planks nailed in crooked rows. Yet, no matter how securely it was sealed, people claimed they heard sounds from inside, soft scraping, the shuffling of feet, and once even the echo of a bell tolling when no one had rung it. The sheriff, now gaunt and sleepless, refused to speak of the chapel at all. He resigned quietly one morning and rode out of town without a word. But the circle hadn't stayed buried. Children still whispered of it, in dreams and in drawings. One girl drew the circle over and over in the dirt behind the schoolhouse. When asked what it meant, she said it wasn't a circle at all. "It's a door," she said, "but it opens downward." Then came the night of the storm. It arrived without warning. No cloud buildup, no wind beforehand. Just a deafening crack of thunder that split the sky in two and sent every oil lamp flickering. Rain came down in sheets so dense it blurred the houses into smudges. And in that moment, as lightning split the clouds above the Caro house, a silhouette appeared in the window. Some said it was Evelyn. Others swore it wasn't human. The next morning, a family of 4 from the neighboring field was missing. Their house was locked from the inside, but the back window was open. On the table sat a game board made of crude wood and string, with tokens made from teeth. No note, no sign of struggle. Only a child's lullaby scratched into the wall with a nail. She played the song, the door unsealed. Now pieces move the game she wields. By April, stories had reached the county seat. They sent a man named Thomas Henley, a former Pinkerton with a reputation for tracking what others wouldn't. He was methodical, skeptical, and deeply practical. He had no patience for superstition. But even he changed after Fallow Ridge. He arrived under gray skies and a low mist, notebook in hand and pistol at his side. He began by interviewing those left in the town, shopkeepers, the postmaster, a few widows. The same stories repeated, strange sounds, disappearing livestock, dreams of a girl who never blinked. Henley visited the Caro house last. He found it unlocked, just as others had described. Everything was preserved, as if time had stopped. Teacups still on their saucers, a shawl draped neatly over the back of the couch. The parlor smelled faintly of cedarwood and dried flowers. But there was something else, too. Something behind the scent, like scorched dust and old paper. In the center of the room was the circle. It had been drawn with charcoal on the hardwood floor, measured with impossible precision. Around the circle were more teeth, small, milk-white, arranged in pairs. Henley counted 13. Then he noticed something stranger. The room was entirely silent. Not muffled, not quiet. Silent. No creaking wood, no birds outside, no wind, as if the room itself had been severed from the rest of the world. He stepped over the threshold of the circle. Instantly, the sound returned, but not as he expected. He heard humming, low, far off, childlike. It grew louder, closer, then stopped altogether. Behind him, a voice, "You're not a player." Henley spun around. The room was empty. He left the house immediately. That night, he wrote in his journal, "There is something here that predates understanding. Not evil, perhaps, but older. As though memory itself is being used like a marionette string. Every detail in that house was preserved not out of nostalgia, but necessity. It's not a shrine, it's a mechanism." He spent the next 3 days examining the chapel. He broke the floorboards where the circle had been found, only to discover a series of shallow pits beneath, each containing remnants, bone fragments, bits of fabric, and once a child's rag doll with its mouth sewn shut. He dug deeper until he reached stone, and etched into that stone were names. Hundreds of names, all children, all local, all missing across the last 60 years. There had been no records, no searches, no outcry. Just whispers. The sort of absence so complete it can only be deliberate. On the last day of his stay, Henley disappeared. His journal was left in the parlor of the Caro house, neatly closed, with a small object placed on top, one of his teeth. By the time his report reached the county seat, the people of Fallow Ridge had already begun to leave. The town was disbanding, not in panic, but in a kind of resignation. Stores closed, schools shuttered, roads overgrown. It was as if the town knew it had reached the end of its turn. But the circle wasn't done. A week after Henley vanished, a letter arrived at the county archives. It was unsigned, postmarked from a nearby town. The handwriting was neat, careful. There is no game, only memory, and she remembers everyone who watched her. Inside the envelope was a photograph, faded and yellowed, showing Evelyn Caro seated in a chair. Her eyes were fixed directly on the camera, not angry, not pleading, just waiting. And at her feet, half shaded in the corner of the image, was a shape, small, blurred, unmistakably childlike. They checked the back of the photo. One word, handwritten in pencil. Next. By midsummer, the name Evelyn Caro had spread far beyond Fallow Ridge. It was whispered in schoolhouses 2 counties over, scribbled in the margins of old hymnals, even murmured by travelers who had never stepped foot in Mississippi. But no one ever spoke her name above a whisper, and no one dared look too long at the photograph. The county archives locked it in a cabinet, filed under recovered evidence, unclassified, but clerks refused to work in the room where it was stored. Some said they heard soft tapping on the glass. Others said the cabinet would sometimes be unlocked in the morning, even though the keys hadn't moved. The photograph was eventually removed and destroyed, or so they thought. A week later, an identical copy appeared, mailed anonymously to the editor of a religious pamphlet called The Southern Sentinel. No return address, just a folded slip of paper with the phrase, "Her turn is not over." The editor, a man named Jonathan Strick, brought the photo to his church elders. He'd assumed it was part of a cruel hoax, maybe linked to the stories drifting up from the rural counties. But the elders grew pale when they saw it. One of them, a former chaplain, collapsed in his seat and wept. "She knows Scripture," he said through trembling lips, "but she never read it." They tried to burn the photograph that night, but it wouldn't take to flame. The edges blackened, yes, but the image itself stayed untouched, as though some varnish protected it from heat. Eventually, they buried it beneath the chapel's cornerstone. 3 days later, the cornerstone cracked in half. The Sentinel never printed another issue. But Evelyn's name continued to circulate, not in ink, but in sleep. People across Mississippi and into Louisiana began reporting similar dreams. A circle carved into hardwood, humming too low to identify, and a girl in a white dress standing just outside the field of vision. Always silent, always watching. These weren't ordinary nightmares. Children would wake up screaming, hands clutched over their mouths. Some were found speaking backwards in the early hours. Others refused to speak at all. And then came the laughter, short, mechanical, not joyous, like the sound of someone pretending they'd once understood joy, but no longer did. The dreams all began the same week a family of 5 moved into the Caro house. They were from Georgia, refugees of the economic collapse still gripping the region. The father, Warren Lewis, was a stonemason who had taken work restoring crumbling churches. The house had been abandoned for nearly 2 years, and the town, what little of it remained, was eager to sell. They got the deed for almost nothing. On the first night, their youngest son, Jeremiah, refused to sleep in the upstairs bedroom. He said the girl in the corner kept clicking her teeth. The parents, attributing it to nerves and the strange acoustics of the old home, moved his bed downstairs. But the clicking continued, sometimes from inside the walls. 3 days later, their eldest daughter stopped responding to her name. She sat for hours on the back porch, staring into the woods behind the house, occasionally humming a tune no one recognized. Her mother found her scrawling words into the dirt, words that matched the writing found on the walls of the chapel years earlier. They sent for the local pastor, who offered to bless the home. But halfway through his prayer, the pastor stopped cold. He looked at the floor, his voice faltering. Then, slowly, he bent down and touched the boards beneath his feet. "There's something under this," he said. He returned the next morning with tools and a lantern. He pried up the floorboards with great care, his hands trembling more with each creak. Beneath them, he found a thin layer of dirt and then stone. A circular slab, smoother than the rest, etched with dozens of symbols none could translate. In the center, a single handprint, small and deeply pressed into the surface. He told the family to leave immediately. That night, the Lewis family fled the house without their belongings. The neighbors saw them drive off, wild-eyed and silent, their youngest child pressing both palms over his ears. The next morning, every window in the Caro house shattered simultaneously. No storm, no wind, just glass, raining outward, and from the broken panes a soft tune could be heard playing. A lullaby, slightly off-key, repeating. No one dared enter the house after that. Local authorities declared it unsafe and boarded it once more. But the dreams didn't stop. If anything, they grew stronger, more vivid. It was no longer just Evelyn. Other figures began to appear. A man in suspenders with a crooked smile, silently dealing cards. A woman in a morning dress, mouthing words without sound. Children with empty eyes sitting in a semicircle, tapping the floor in unison. And always Evelyn, never older, never blinking, standing just behind them all, holding something no one could quite see. But everyone felt it. A weight, a presence, an understanding that the game wasn't just about turns, but about remembering who played. Those who dreamed began writing things without realizing it. One man in Alabama woke up to find an entire journal filled with diagrams and numbers he couldn't explain. A school teacher in Tennessee drew a map of Fallow Ridge, despite never having visited. It wasn't spreading through the photograph anymore. It was something deeper, something older. A song not carried on sound, but on memory. And Evelyn, whatever she truly was, had become its conductor. By the fall of 1862, Fallow Ridge had become more myth than place. No stagecoach passed through it anymore. Maps redrew the borders subtly, erasing the road that once curved into the wooded hollow where the Caro house still stood. Even train lines, when proposed by northern surveyors, seemed to divert themselves as if by instinct. And yet the dreams didn't stop. In fact, they multiplied. Hospitals from New Orleans to Chattanooga reported a strange influx of cases, patients unable to speak, waking each night at exactly 3:17 a.m., covered in dirt, nails cracked and muddy. When asked what they'd been dreaming about, most just shook their heads. But a few repeated the same word, circle. A quiet investigation began, led unofficially by Dr. Elias Tern, a physician from Vicksburg with a reputation for chasing the unexplainable. Tern had grown up hearing stories of the girl who played alone, and had dismissed them until a patient under his care, an 8-year-old girl named Beatrice, began sketching the Caro house in charcoal, without ever having seen it. He asked her where she had seen that building. She said, "In the room under the singing." That was all it took. Tern gathered what little information remained, records half-burnt in courthouse fires, articles that had been redacted or removed from public view, and, of course, the photograph. or what he believed to be a copy. Because no matter how many copies were destroyed or hidden, another always seemed to resurface, often in places that should have been inaccessible. Once, he found one tucked inside a hollow hymnal at a chapel that hadn't hosted a service in 30 years. The girl in the photo was always Evelyn. Same dress, same eyes. Only the background changed. Sometimes the circle behind her was ash. Other times, it was wood, carved deep into floorboards like a scar. And once, only once, he saw it glowing faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if the photograph had caught fire in frozen time. It was then he understood. This wasn't about one girl, it was about the game. He made his way to Fallow Ridge in October, riding a borrowed horse and carrying a satchel of handwritten notes, charms sewn into the lining of his coat, and a journal sealed with wax. No one lived in the town by then. The buildings had collapsed into the soil. The schoolhouse was little more than a skeleton of beams and wind-warped desks. But the Caro house remained untouched. The boards covering the windows looked new. The hinges on the front door gleamed silver in the moonlight. And above the porch, etched into the wood, was a single sentence. She played for hours, until it was your turn. Inside, the air was warm, as if the house had been expecting him. Dr. Turn lit a lantern, though he would later write that the darkness in the house didn't behave normally. It moved, it breathed, and sometimes, when he turned too quickly, it held shape for a moment longer than it should. He found the circle in the parlor, exactly where the pastor had uncovered it years ago. Only now, it had grown. What was once a simple ring etched into the floor had become a series of concentric lines, each with different symbols carved along the edges. At the center, the handprint remained, but it was no longer a child's. It was larger, adult-sized, and burned into the wood like a brand. He kneeled beside it and placed the lantern down. As he did, the house exhaled. That was the only way he could describe it. A long, slow breath that came from nowhere and everywhere. Then he heard it. A soft tapping from the ceiling above, followed by something even more unnerving. A laugh. Faint, feminine, and absolutely humorless. Dr. Turn called out, "Evelyn?" The tapping stopped. For a long moment, the silence pressed in on him like water. Then, slowly, footsteps began descending the staircase at the end of the hallway. But no one appeared. Each step creaked under invisible weight, growing closer and closer until the final step let out a long, groaning sigh. And then, she spoke, but not aloud. The voice was in his mind, sharp, clear, impossibly young. "Do you remember how to play?" He froze. The journal in his satchel burst into flame without warning. He ripped it out and threw it across the room, but it continued burning in mid-air, pages turning to ash without touching the floor. The symbols in the circle began to glow faintly, not with light, but with memory. He saw images, not with his eyes, but behind them. A child alone in the attic, drawing symbols into the dust. A girl humming in reverse. A mother weeping outside a locked door. A storm that never touched the house. And the game, always the game. Chalk, a spinning top. Stones arranged just so. Simple rules that no one taught. But once you started, you couldn't stop, because the game was never for fun. It was for feeding. The circle began to pulse. Turn backed away, but the air thickened. His limbs moved slower, his breath ragged. He turned to flee, but the hallway stretched, grew longer. Impossible angles folding over each other like pages in a cursed book. Then he heard the song, a nursery rhyme with no melody, no origin, just rhythm and power. One for sorrow, 2 for sight, 3 to play beneath the night. And Evelyn stood behind him. Not aged, not dead, just waiting. Her eyes were exactly as the stories described, wide, luminous, and wholly wrong. She held a doll in her hands, its face an exact replica of his. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed, and the last thing he heard before darkness took him was the sound of a chair sliding back across wood. An invitation. A turn. And somewhere outside, miles away, a child sat up in bed, humming a song she didn't know, and drawing circles she'd never seen. The next morning, a mail courier named Jonah Price passed by the hollow edge of Fallow Ridge. He was running the long route from Yazoo City to Jackson, riding under heavy fog, when his horse suddenly stopped on the ridge above the hollow and refused to go further. Price, a seasoned rider and Civil War veteran, wasn't a man easily spooked, but the animal's breath steamed violently, eyes wide, muscles trembling as if standing on a battlefield. Price dismounted, patting the horse, whispering steady reassurances. That's when he heard it. A faint music, childlike, circular, and slow. Like a music box winding endlessly in reverse. It came not from the forest or the wind, but from beneath the ground. Price didn't investigate. He simply turned the horse around and added 5 miles to his journey that day, returning by the northern path. But when he passed through town the next day, he couldn't resist asking the sheriff if there was anything new from the Caro place. The sheriff narrowed his eyes. "A fire," he said, but no smoke. 2 days prior, a traveling physician had gone missing after heading to Fallow Ridge. His name was Elias Tern. They'd found his horse tied to a dead tree. No tracks, no lantern, just a scorched ring in the grass, and something buried in the soil. It was a chair, half-buried, wooden, and child-sized, except the proportions were all wrong. The back too tall. The seat slanted strangely as if built for someone who didn't sit like people normally did. Carved into the seat was one word: yours. By the time word reached Vicksburg, Dr. Tern's home had been ransacked. Not robbed, emptied. Drawers pulled out, medical records gone. His journal, presumed lost in the fire, had been replaced by a different one that hadn't been written yet. The entries began a week after his disappearance and continued for 17 pages, all written in his handwriting, all dated forward. Each page described what the writer saw from the circle. Not where they were, but what they saw. Images of strangers walking into their own homes, friends saying things out of order, and familiar places rotting slightly at the edges. Reality viewed from outside the glass. The final entry simply read, "I can't stop watching her play." And below it, a child's drawing of a figure sitting on a too-tall chair, eyes blackened with charcoal. That drawing found its way to the desk of Dr. Samuel Wexley, a professor of psychological theology at Tulane University. He was an academic known for investigating historical anomalies that bordered the supernatural, cases where mass hallucination, folklore, and psychology blurred together. He called it cultural hauntology. Wexley dismissed the case at first, but the name Evelyn Caro kept resurfacing in records spanning nearly 50 years, appearing in connection to other strange disappearances in the region. In one 1891 photo from a church picnic in Lafayette, she stood in the background, a child in a faded dress, off-center, eyes fixed not on the camera, but on the viewer. Another photograph, dated 1869, from a missionary expedition to an abandoned mining town in Arkansas, showed her again. Same age, same dress, this time sitting at a wooden table surrounded by empty plates. But the expedition members had all vanished. The photo was found stuffed into the wall of a collapsed chapel. Wexley traveled to Fallow Ridge in the spring of 1892. What remained was barely traceable. Just a few crooked stones, sunken fence posts, and the outline of a house flattened by time. But the parlor room floor was still intact, covered in moss and vine. The circle remained. He didn't step inside it. Instead, he recorded what he called auditory anomalies. Standing 3 feet from the center, he picked up low vibrations on his wax cylinder recorder, strange chords that didn't match any known instrument, mixed with laughter played backward. He heard a voice in the recording later when he returned to New Orleans. A girl's voice whispering, "Another one's waiting." Wexley published his findings in a private academic journal, though few took it seriously. Many believed the photos were altered, the recordings faked. But others, quiet researchers, religious historians, even foreign folklorists, began tracking the patterns for themselves. Each found a version of the game. Not always called the same thing. Not always involving circles. But always tied to a child who never aged, who taught no one the rules, but punished those who stopped playing. In 1887, a case surfaced in North Carolina of a girl named Ellie C., who had lived alone in a cabin after her parents' disappearance. Locals heard her singing each night, always the same pattern. When a sheriff investigated, he returned mute, his hair white as snow, carrying a drawing of a circle with 7 marks. In 1893, a woman in Illinois claimed to have been raised by a sister named Evelyn, only no records of her existence ever surfaced. The woman described their games in detail: stone placement, counting rhythms, and the chant. When asked what happened to Evelyn, she simply said, "She played through me." And in 1899, a boy in Mississippi was found asleep in his backyard, circled by chairs, 7 of them. Each chair was occupied by a doll. One chair was empty. The boy said, "She's waiting for the one who listened." The patterns began spreading beyond the South. But no matter how far the stories reached, Maine, California, even northern Canada, the rules remained eerily consistent. The girl never aged. She never spoke aloud. And once you heard the song, you were already playing. It wasn't about haunting. It wasn't about evil in the traditional sense. It was a loop, a recursion, a game that didn't want to be won, only continued. And the deeper scholars looked, the more they realized. This wasn't a story born in the 1800s. It was far older. Some saw echoes of it in ancient rituals, nursery rhymes, even religious hymns translated incorrectly, a game between dimensions, a language made of rhythm and intent. But they were too late, because the moment you began researching it, tracing her name, listening to the chant, you were stepping closer to the circle. And if you ever found the center, you didn't return, you watched. As she played. This is where she stopped. The photograph was faded, poorly developed, and cracked at the corners. It showed a dirt clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, somewhere rural, somewhere forgotten. At the center of the photo stood a girl, barefoot, her dress mid-turn in motion, arms out as if balancing. Her eyes were fixed on the camera. The bottom corner bore a hand-scratched date, 1857. But it wasn't the year that disturbed Miriam. It was the background. Behind the girl, etched faintly into the ground like pressed footprints, was the same circular symbol reported by Dr. Wexley and others. 7 spokes branching out. A hollow center. What appeared to be chalk or ash dusted across the edges. But more haunting was what lay outside the circle. 7 chairs. Real wooden chairs, each facing inward, and one was toppled over. Within a week, Miriam resigned from her post, citing interior reasons of the spirit. She donated the photo to the private collection of St. Augustine Seminary and vanished from the public record. That photograph was never displayed, but it re-emerged in 1910 in the possession of a railway inspector named Julian Roth, who claimed to have found it inside the lining of an abandoned child's suitcase. Roth had no knowledge of Alder or the archive. He'd simply taken a wrong turn on the southern Louisiana track line when his torch revealed the suitcase, tucked neatly into the corner of a rusted, stationary car. Inside the suitcase were 7 smooth stones, a small chair carved from a single block of wood, and the photograph. And Roth had begun hearing music in his sleep. Not dreams, not memories, but a steady, looping melody that seemed to pulse from the floorboards beneath his bed. When he tried to trace the tune, he'd find his own hands tapping out a rhythm on the window ledge, without knowing how he'd begun. His sleep deteriorated. His speech grew erratic. He stopped using names entirely. He referred to his wife only as the one beside, and refused to walk through doorways without knocking first. "So she knows I'm not a trick," he'd whisper. When he was eventually committed, the suitcase was lost. But in his final written statement, smuggled to a local priest, he described a vision. A wide field, chairs in a circle, and a child at the center who played a game no one else could follow. He wrote, "The game isn't made of rules. It's made of memory. The longer you look, the more of you she keeps. By now, what was once folklore had taken on a new shape." Researchers who trace the Evelyn figure, under aliases like Clara, Ruth, Ellie, or the one who hums, began compiling a kind of behavioral catalog. Certain traits were always present. She never aged. She appeared before or after disappearances. Her presence was always preceded by sound, rhythm, lullaby, tapping. And most disturbingly, she seemed to seek replication. A folklorist from Quebec, Jean-Baptiste Leroux, identified a repeating structure in every known case. A girl is seen playing alone. A circle is discovered, either physical or auditory. An adult attempts to interrupt or understand the game. The adult disappears, forgets themselves, or begins drawing symbols. The game resumes with someone new. He coined the phenomenon the recursive maiden. Leroux proposed that this figure, whoever or whatever she was, functioned not as a ghost or demon, but a kind of event. A cognitive contagion encoded through behavior, music, posture, repetition, an echo with teeth. In 1913, a young girl in Biloxi named Grace Myers vanished during recess at school. Her teacher reported hearing a soft clapping coming from the edge of the woods. The girl had been alone near the tree line, humming to herself. Only her shoes were found, and scratched into the bark of a nearby cypress were 3 letters, EVC. Evelyn Caro. The name whispered again. That fall, a pastor from Alabama claimed during a sermon that he'd seen the circle girl at the foot of his bed. He described her as neither angry nor sorrowful, but empty. "Like a room without furniture," he said. "Something is speaking through her, but she doesn't know the words." His congregation dismissed it as poetic madness until his daughter went missing. A note was left on her pillow. "She taught me." Then came the audio recordings. In 1921, an early phonograph technician named Henry Dale played back an accidental recording captured during a séance session in Baton Rouge. The device had malfunctioned, reversing part of the audio, but what played back shocked everyone in the room. Amid distorted voices and creaks, a clear child's voice emerged. "I didn't invite you to stop." Dale tried to recreate the session. The tape dissolved in his hands. Now the question wasn't whether Evelyn was real. It was whether the idea of her could be stopped at all, because each attempt to erase the memory, burn the notes, destroy the symbols, silence the melody, only made it return. Not the same way, not in the same place, but it always returned. As if the game wasn't bound to time, as if we were the ones aging, forgetting, breaking the rules, while she kept playing. Even today, fragments appear on obscure forums, in haunted museum archives, in whispered YouTube videos that claim to have the sound. They always end the same way. A circle, a girl, and one seat left. Still waiting, still calling. Because the game wasn't meant to be won. It was meant to keep going. And now, if you've read this far, you've already heard it, even if you don't remember. Especially if you don't.